This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 30 of Lex Out Loud, Writing Science Fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm writing my third novel and I'm taking you along for the journey. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the pre-writing I did for these stories, and I'll talk about why I started writing a prequel before I wrote the main story, and why that actually ended up being the perfect approach for me to take with this particular project. So yeah, that's what we're talking about today. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to season 2. We're just chugging along here. So I really don't know how common this is, kind of how I've approached this whole thing. I feel like it's kind of weird, maybe, but I don't know, maybe not. I really have no idea. I do know that a lot of writers do some form of pre-writing or some forms of pre-writing before they really get going on the actual manuscript. There's a lot of different things people will do to kind of get ready for that. So pre-writing can take a lot of different forms for different people. A lot of times it ends up being world building and character building information that doesn't really go into the final book, more background, backstory kind of stuff. So I guess, from that point of view, coming up with stuff that could ultimately end up going into a prequel story maybe isn't that uncommon for writers. Maybe it's something that a lot of novel writers do, especially those writing in genres that involve a lot of world building, like fantasy and science fiction, for example. But I do know that it's quite common for writers to do quite a bit of pre-writing before they find the story, or to do actual writing before they find the story. I've heard it's pretty common for the first few chapters of a novel to either get cut out eventually or rewritten once the writer figures out what the story really is and where the best place to start is, once they've taken it through the editing process one or more times. And the way I've heard that described, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is, you've got this idea for a story and you just kind of start writing it. And sometimes, those first couple, 2, 3, however many chapters in the beginning is really you kind of telling yourself the setting and what the characters are like, and kind of finding your way into the story. And then once you've written the whole thing and you go back to revise it, you realize that a lot of that stuff in the beginning is either not needed, it was mainly for you to help you figure things out, and it's not something the reader needs to see, or it's information that would be better conveyed later in the story in a different way, like through dialogue or something like that. And a lot of times, part of the editing process is looking at what you've written and asking yourself, okay, where does this story really start? Where do things really get interesting? Where is really the best place to start? And oftentimes that is not where you actually originally started, and you end up cutting out the first few chapters or repurposing them and using some of that stuff elsewhere. So it was kind of a different process for me this time. Anyway, for some reason, I was quite taken with this first smaller cylinder built above the moon, which right now I'm calling Luna City. Even though I've always wanted the story to take place on a large city, a metropolis-sized city, a cylinder with anywhere from 750,000 to maybe as much as 5 million people, like a big, big city. So that's kind of been the idea from the beginning. But as I started fleshing things out as far as the setting, I was really fascinated by this first cylinder that was built for around 40,000 people, so a much smaller one. It would be the first one ever built and a smaller community than the ones that would come later. Although, at 40,000 people, it's still pretty large. But even so, it might have more of a kind of a frontier town kind of feel to it because this is the first thing like this. Everybody living here, this is the first time they've lived someplace like this. So it'd be a very different kind of thing than further in the future where, millions of people live like this now and it's been going on for centuries. But for whatever reason, that cylinder, that first one, Luna City, was really grabbing my imagination. So when I decided to try the brute force writing and just get writing, part of how to make that work for me was to write about what I was most excited about or most interested in or what I felt I had the most material for. So I decided to start writing something set at that first cylinder, even though I really didn't have any intention of that being the main story. At this point, I was just like, I want to just get going. I just want to get writing in the setting. And right now, most of my ideas that I'm excited about are about this first cylinder. So I'll start there just to get going. And then once I feel I have a good rhythm or I know where I want to go, then I can start writing about the later cylinder and what would be the actual story. That was kind of what I was thinking. Also, in some ways, and I don't know if this is really true, but in my mind, it seemed like it would be easier to write about this first city, Luna City, because it was smaller with less people. So I don't really know from a writing perspective if there's really much difference between writing about a population of 40,000 versus a population of 750,000. At the end of the day, I suspect that they're pretty much the same. But in my mind, it seemed like it would be easier. It was more, more approachable in some way. I think one of the things that really excited me about writing about this first cylinder was that I could have my main character, my point of view character in that story be someone who's just arrived at the cylinder and they've never been in space before or anything like that. So that would let me explore the cylinder myself as I wrote about it for the first time because I was in the first one ever built. So everything there has been done for the first time. And I'm also seeing it through the eyes of someone who's just arrived there for the first time and they've never been anywhere like this before. So it gave me the ability through the point of view of my main character to talk about the most basic things, things that someone who just arrived from Earth and has never been anywhere like this before, things that someone like that person would notice, which also conveniently are things that if the reader were in that position are things that they would notice. So I felt like it gave me a really good opportunity to explain things on a very basic level to the reader in a way that made sense and wouldn't just be an info dump, because these would be observations and thoughts that the main character would be making and having about what they were experiencing. It would make perfect sense. So in that way, writing a story set on this first cylinder from the point of view of someone who's just arrived there for the first time was the perfect way to start exploring the setting myself and to get a feel for what it would be like to live there and especially what it would be like to first arrive there and to kind of acclimate to it. So for the main story, I'm fast forwarding another 100 or so years beyond that point onto a much larger cylinder, as I said. I'm still not exactly sure how big it's going to be, either around 750,000 people or around 5 million. And that really boils down to whether I want it to be made of titanium or graphene. And right now I'm leaning towards the 750,000 because that way I can make it made of titanium and I don't have to worry about would we be able to mass produce graphene on that scale by that point? Is that even possible? Does graphene really have the properties that we think it would at that level? All of which are things we don't right now know. So I wouldn't have to answer those if I made it titanium. And then it also gives me somewhere to go in the future, because then eventually they will make one of graphene, assuming it has the properties we think it will. So that could always be something I could still do later if or when I wanted to. So this is a much larger cylinder, and at this point, there have been quite a few of these built of different sizes. So it's kind of people are used to this now. This has been going on for a while now, for a couple generations or a few generations. So for me as a writer, it really helped to explore and experience someone new to this first cylinder to help me then wrap my brain around someone who lives in one of these much larger ones, someone who lives in one of these cylinders with hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of people on board, at a time when, this is all much more established and just kind of everyday life for a lot of people. So I hope that makes sense. But at least to me, it was a much more natural way to approach it. Kind of the idea you have to know where you've been before you can know where you're going kind of thing. So that's kind of why I did it this way, even if, maybe it's a weird way to do things. I don't know. That was my reasoning at the time. So the next kind of part of this I want to talk about is kind of how this worked out and how it actually worked out quite well, and whether that was intentional design on my part or serendipity. I'm not sure, probably a combination of the two. But before I get into that, just some other forms of pre-writing that people do other than doing a prequel. People will often write an outline. There's a couple forms of pre-writing we just talked about in a recent episode, writing an interview with a character in which the writer or another character asks the character questions and then the character answers them in their own voice. That's another kind of pre-writing that people will do, or writing a conversation between two characters that maybe will or won't be in the story, but just kind of a way to get to know those two characters and figure out the dynamics of their relationship. That's a form of pre-writing you can do. Writing a description or an opening shot of the location for the first or any scene in the story is another thing you could do. Writing up information on the various characters in the story, facts about them, descriptions of them, things like that. And also just world building, writing information on the locations where the story will take place. So those are all different forms of pre-writing that writers do. I'm sure there's more that I've forgotten or didn't think of. So as I said, this whole process ended up working really well. I'm really could not be more pleased with how this has all kind of come together. I think in the beginning, really, it was mostly a thing of just going where my interest and my excitement was, because I was having a bit of a hard time getting started. And I decided to do this brute force writing where I'm not going to be concerned about, is this something that's going to be in the book? I just want to start writing in the setting just to get going, to get some momentum. And in order to do that, it just made sense to me to just write about what I had the most ideas for, or what I was most excited about at the time, which for whatever reason was this first cylinder, was not where I was planning for the story to actually take place. But I was really taken with the idea of this first cylinder and what that would be like. And I had some ideas for exploring that really interested me. So I think the main reason I started with a prequel was because that's where most of my ideas were at the time. But there were other reasons too. Like I said, the first cylinder would be a lot smaller than the one in the main story with a smaller population, which, whether it's true or not, made it at least seem to me like it would be more approachable. I also had the idea of starting with the main character first arriving on the cylinder, so that in that way I could have a character that would have a very similar outlook and point of view as the reader would if they found themselves in that situation. I also had done quite a bit of research into space sickness and sickness you can get from being in a rotating environment. And if I wrote a story about this first cylinder, about a character newly arrived there, then I could pull all of that information in and everything I learned about that, which some of it I thought was pretty interesting. If I had the main character be someone who's especially sensitive to those things, which those people exist. Some people won't be bothered by zero gravity. Other people will be slightly bothered. Other people will be bothered a lot. The same thing with being in a rotating environment. So I thought, if my main character is someone who is more sensitive to those things, and I can describe, the difficulty she has acclimating, which would give people a good sense of the different and how this is just a very different place where, your gravity isn't coming from being on a huge planet that has so much mass that the gravity holds you down. Instead, you're being spun inside of a cylinder. So I had the idea of, starting with this main character. It's her first time in space. It's her first time on a cylinder. And this way I can have the point of view of someone who's experiencing all these things for the first time, but at the same time, they understand it. She's someone that, did a lot of research and reading up on what to expect. So everything that was happening to her, she understood why it was happening and what was going on. And so in that way, I could help the reader understand what was going on. So I thought by having the main character be sensitive to the rotation, not only could I kind of explain how that works to the reader and how that can make some people sick, but I could also give them a more visceral, literally, feel for what being on one of those cylinders would really be like for someone who'd never done that before. And, that was another part of why I wanted to start with this prequel, because I knew that any of these issues that someone might have with the rotation would be much less of a factor in the much larger cylinder of Union City. The bigger diameter you make these things, the more slowly they need to spin to produce 1 g of artificial gravity. So the one, on Luna City that is much smaller in diameter will spin much faster at a higher RPM than the much larger Union City above Earth. So if I wanted to have a character that was really sensitive to that, it really made more sense to have that happen on the smaller cylinder, because the one above Earth is so big that it may not really bother anyone. The rotation rate would be so low that you might not even notice it much, even if you were brand new there. So just from a kind of realism point of view, it made a lot more sense if I was going to really focus on a character who's really getting sick from this or having some problems with it. It really made sense to do that with a smaller with a smaller cylinder. And then also, if I ever published the prequel, then that's a distinction I could draw in the main story, especially because I ended up deciding that Tia, the main character of the main story, actually grew up on Luna City. She grew up on the smaller cylinder, and right before the main story starts, she is moved to Union City, to the larger cylinder. So I can even have her notice how much less of a factor the rotation is there because it's so much slower. And that would be something, people would understand very well if they'd read the prequel. So yeah, with this larger cylinder of Union City, it just really wouldn't make a lot of sense to have someone who was bothered by the rotation to the degree I wanted to really drive that point home. It just wouldn't have made sense. And it would have made the main character seem flawed or weak in a way that would not have been desirable for me or for the reading experience. So it just made a lot more sense, if I wanted to do that, to do it with the smaller cylinder of Luna City over the moon. And by the way, I did a whole episode where I talked about rotation rates and the sickness that can cause and all that. So if you're new to the show and you're, you don't know about all that, go check out the earlier episodes. And I did a whole episode talking about that. You can learn all about it. And in the show notes for that episode, I even have links to more information if you want to dive even deeper. So that's kind of where I was coming from and why I decided to start with a prequel as part of my pre-writing. And yeah, as far as what I've talked about so far, that was planned. That was kind of the idea going into it. However, I'm pretty sure that the idea of exploring my book's main character by fleshing out an ancestor only came later. I don't think I had that idea in the very beginning, because I didn't even know that the main character was going to be an ancestor or a descendant of the character from the prequel. I didn't really figure that out until I'd already started writing the prequel material And I'd started fleshing out the main character for that, who is the grandmother, Tia, or Tia the older. And after I had decided to make the main character of the main story, which takes place 100 some years later, have the main character of that be the granddaughter of the character from the prequel. So yeah, basically kind of how that went down is I just started writing the prequel stuff, and I started, the very first scene I wrote was Tia the grandmother on a spaceship, approaching the cylinder of Luna City, which is a rotating cylinder habitat on top of a space elevator that goes down to the moon. If you know about such things, it's at the Earth Moon L1 Lagrangian point. That's where Luna City is. And then from there down to the surface of the moon is a space elevator. So at this time in the story, there is a space elevator on Earth, but there isn't a cylinder there yet. So the way that Tia or anyone else would get to Luna City from Earth is they would ride the space elevator from the surface of Earth up to geostationary orbit above Earth. And there at the top of the space elevator was a counterweight and a space station that was basically like a port. And then from there, you could take a ship from geostationary orbit from Earth to Luna City at the Earth Moon L1 point. And so the prequel story begins when Tia's on this ship and they're approaching Luna City. She can see the cylinder as they approach on the ship. And that's where I start the story. And on, this ship, it's microgravity. There's basically zero gravity on the ship. And she's already been struggling with space sickness in that environment. And then the story follows her as the ship lands and she disembarks and is on the cylinder now. And where the ship lands is in the central part of the cylinder that doesn't rotate. So there's no gravity there either. But then she goes to the habitat area of the cylinder where there is full gravity. And so now she's in a Earth-like gravity environment, but now she's also in an environment that's rotating, and she starts having to deal with that. So that's how it starts. So that whole thing, writing that was really fun and an interesting experience, because when I started writing those scenes, I had a few vague ideas about what kind of person the main character would be. But in a lot of ways, I kind of discovered who she was as I wrote those scenes, and, quickly realized that she was very independent, very capable person. And although, she was suffering quite a bit from nausea and dizziness and vertigo and headache and all those things from the microgravity and then from the rotation, despite that, she was very, she wasn't completely incapacitated by it. She was maintaining as well as she could, and very concerned about not appearing weak or not appearing like she couldn't handle it. And one of the first people she meets on Luna City that greet her at the airport, so to speak, is a guy that's actually going to be her boss. She's come there to take a job as a robotics engineer. And her boss meets her to greet her and help her get settled in. And he is very understanding and accommodating that, she doesn't feel well, and, keeps reassuring her that, some people have these issues, not everybody does, but some people do. And nobody thinks less of her because of it. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. She'll feel better in a few days, kind of thing. But she's trying very hard to make a good impression on her new boss and all this stuff. And, I follow her as she, sees her new apartment. She goes and gets a medical checkup, and she's kind of touring the neighborhood where she lives and seeing, what's around and stuff like that. And it's just kind of, her checking out her new home. is what a lot of this is. But through that, I'm exploring the environment and explaining the environment as she learns about it and discovers it herself. And through this, I went from having just a few vague ideas for a character to having not only a pretty solid feel for who this woman was, but I could also see her arc through the prequel, because I already had ideas for kind of the situation of the prequel that she was in the future going to deal with, which is the thing that ends up her being a hero in this place. And, she was going to have to rise above or rise to the situation. And in order to deal with the situation that was coming, she was going to have to go far beyond her comfort zone, far beyond what she'd trained for what she expected would be required of her. And, she would rise to the occasion and be successful and in the process become a hero and save a bunch of lives. And so I kind of saw her whole arc. So I knew not only who this character is now, but I knew who this character was going to be at the end of the story of the prequel. And I think it was about this time I started thinking about the character for the main story, because I knew that I didn't want, because I did for a while consider making what I decided would be the prequel, making that the main story. I'm like, well, if this is what I'm excited about, this first cylinder, maybe this is what I should write about. And I seriously considered it. And to be honest, the reason that I didn't do that, really the main reason, is that the situation that I'd come up with for that, although I think it will be a good story, was not a story I was wanting to write right now. Every time I started thinking about what would be required to write this story, I just was not on board with that. I just didn't want to do it. I didn't want to tell that story right now, even though I love the character, Tia's grandmother. I love her. I love the character. I'd love to explore the character, but I just didn't want to write the story that I'd come up with for her, at least not at this time. I think in the future, I'll be happy to write it. But right now, it's just not where my head is at. And also just, this whole thing has been based on the foundational idea from the very beginning of a large metropolis in space. And I still wanted to do that. And I also wanted it to be one of at least a few other cylinders. I didn't want it to be the only one, where at this point in the story, Luna City is the only one. So despite how much I was liking this character, it's not what I wanted to do for the book I wanted to write. So I started thinking about the character for that book, because I'm like, I can't just make, this Tia's granddaughter, who's going to be the main character of book one. I can't just make her exactly like this Tia that I've been exploring and like so much, even though that would be the easy thing to do. And I considered doing that. I'm like, well, I could make this character the main character. And then if or when I actually write this prequel story for real, then I could just come up with a different main character for that. And I considered that because I liked this character that much that I was like, well, maybe I can shoehorn her into the other story and just use her as is. But the more I thought about that, the more I realized that, she was very much, not completely, but a big part of who she was and who she was going to become as a character was a product of her environment. And so I couldn't just put that character in a completely different environment and have it really make any sense. So I started thinking about, okay, I love this character, but it's just not the right character for the story I want to tell right now. So I need to come up with a new character. And it was somewhere in here that I had the idea of, well, what if the character in the main story is this character's descendant, like daughter or granddaughter or great granddaughter, depending, how far in the future I'm going and how long the generations are. Maybe she's directly descended from this character. And then in that way, the things I know about this character can at least help me a little bit with the new character because she's a member of the family, an ancestor. So I kind of like that idea. And as soon as I decided I liked that idea, I went directly to, let's make her a direct descendant. Let's make her either the original Tia's daughter or her granddaughter or however many generations it is, but she's a direct descendant. And so I started thinking about the new Tia, the younger Tia that was going to be my main character for the book and what I wanted that character to be like. And starting off with the launch point of she needs to be different than the first Tia. I don't want them to be the same character. And especially now that I'm thinking more likely that I'll at some point write the prequel because I like that character so much, I especially want them to be distinct characters if the reader is someday going to meet the grandmother Tia. I don't want them to be like, wow, this is like the same character that I already know. So I needed to make them different, but also have some similarities. So one way I decided to make them the same was that they would basically have very similar professions, because part of the beginning of creating the main character for the story was deciding what her profession was. What does she do on the cylinder? And I had a lot of different ideas and that I kicked around, but very clearly my favorite was having her work with robots, because I wanted to do a lot with robots in the setting anyway, and that would be an easy way to pull that in and have it be relevant. And I just love robots, and so much during this time period will be done with robots. It just made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. So the original Tia for the prequel is a robotics engineer, which means she actually designs robots from the ground up, programs them, writes the code, all that stuff. So I wanted, the new Tia to be in robotics too. And I don't really remember at this point, like which ideas came in what order. But, starting out with, I want the new Tia to be similar to the old Tia in some ways, but different in others. I also thought about just kind of in general what kind of character I wanted her to be. And I wanted her to be more relatable, more of an everyman kind of character. I wanted her to be a little more less by the book, more rebellious than the older Tia, more of wants to go her own way, wants to live her life her way kind of person. Maybe a little snarky, maybe a little irreverent, things like that. And I was like, yeah, that's, and that will be different from the Tia I've established in the prequel. And then I started thinking about the fact that her grandmother is a hero. And at that point, the pieces just started fitting together. And I realized that my Tia in the main story, her grandmother is this hero. She was born and raised on Luna City, where her grandmother was the most famous she could be, because that was the actual community that she had saved. So there she is. They have a statue of her. They have 2 holidays honoring her in Luna City. She's a big deal there. So my main character is someone whose grandmother is someone that everyone knows, everyone looks up to. And so her whole life, she's grown up under this shadow of this ancestor who just everybody admires. And so her whole life, she's been compared to her grandmother and expected to kind of live up to the example that her grandmother set and kind of be on that level. And so that's largely what she's rebelling against in the beginning of the book. She doesn't want to be like that. She's tired of being compared to her grandmother. She's tired of being measured against her grandmother, what her grandmother did at a certain similar age and things like that. And she is tired of being recognized in that way and wants to make her own name for herself and do her own thing. And yet she has a lot in common with her grandmother, including a love of robots. So the younger Tia in the main story also works with robots, but instead of being an engineer, she's a technician. So it's kind of a lower level thing than what her grandmother was doing. So when, her grandmother designed the robots and built them up from square one, where the younger Tia in the main story is someone who works with the robots. So she operates them, fixes them when they need fixed, things like that, maintenance, stuff like that. So she doesn't design them, doesn't build them, but works with them and on them. So she's in the same field, just at a lower level. And that's also kind of a sticking point with the character, because at the age that Tia the Younger is in the story, she has a bachelor's degree, I believe. And, her grandmother had I think it was a master's, at not much older. So, already she hasn't lived up, because she's not as far along in her education as her grandmother was at her age. And she has a lower position than her grandmother did. So that's a lot of the source of internal conflict for this character, is constantly being held up to her grandmother's example. And at least in her mind, not measuring up. So again, at least from the very beginning, this wasn't planned. It was a lot of, me kind of following my instincts and doing what seemed the easiest, or where I had the most material or ideas, and then using what I came up with and making the most of it and kind of following it where it took me. But it turned out that getting to know the grandmother character and then building my main character, Tia, in some ways as a reaction to that character, really helped me to flesh out Tia, my main character, and create a depth to her that I think would have taken me a lot longer to get to if I hadn't done this prequel stuff first. If I just started writing the main story with this main character, I think I might have ultimately gotten there, but it would have taken me a lot longer, and I would have gotten a lot farther into the book before I knew this character to the degree that I do now. And I'm just getting started. In some ways, I actually think that the prequel might be a better introduction to the setting and the story than the book I'm wanting to write, because it takes place closer to our own time. I think it's like 100 and some years in the future, where the main story is 200 and some years in the future. So in that way, it might be a little more relatable because less time has passed. The whole, living in orbital cylinder cities thing is just starting. This is the first one in the prequel. So in that way, I think it would be an easier place to start and to kind of introduce people to the setting and whatnot. So in a way, it's almost too bad that I'm not really jazzed about that particular story for the prequel right now. Because I don't know, maybe if I was and I could write that really well, that might maybe be a better place to kick things off than where I'm planning to. But, when I think about that, I always think about the advice of, beginning the story where things get interesting, and beginning as close to the actual story that you want to tell as you can, and not starting out with a bunch of preamble that isn't really needed. So I feel like, the story of the larger cylinder is really the story I want to tell. And the prequel would just be a really huge prologue. And, common wisdom is you don't want a prologue. You want to start with chapter 1. The reader doesn't want to start out a book with a bunch of background that isn't relevant right now. They want to start with what's happening right now. I do think I will probably write the prequel at some point. I think that's much more likely now, just because I do have a pretty solid idea for the situation of that story. And I do really like the main character and some of the supporting characters I've come up with for it. Which, by the way, when I was going through everything I'd written and deciding, what's going to be part of the prequel, what's going to be part of the first book, at the beginning of that process, I was really hoping to use some of the characters I came up with in the prequel, and even some of the scenes I'd written, that I could just kind of transplant those to the main story. But it turned out that all of those things, those scenes and those characters, were so enmeshed in the environment of this first cylinder that in order to make them work in the main story, I'd have to completely change them anyway. So all that stayed in the prequel, which makes actually writing that a lot easier, because all that work I've done on it is still there. I didn't chop it out and put it in the main book. So I think it's pretty likely. I mean, assuming that people like these stories and they read them and they want more, I think it's pretty likely that at some point I will write this prequel. At this point, I would guess that it would be a novella as opposed to a novel, but, who knows until I actually do it. So I think maybe, possibly, this approach would not have worked so well if I were just aiming to write a single book. But since I'm wanting to build a setting in which I can tell numerous stories, and that's been the plan all along, and, right now the thought is I would write numerous stories in the setting. Some would be connected to one another, some not, but they'd all take place in the same universe, so to speak. So, with that being the case, it's been a really good thing. And it was an approach that worked really well. And again, that's why I spent so much time world building, is because this was a setting is a setting I intend to use more than just one book, for just one book. And it's kind of they feed into each other. I wanted a really well-developed setting, and I wanted to be able to really put a lot of time and effort into the setting and make the setting as realistic and cool and interesting as I could. And by using that for more than just one book, it really let me go all out on that. If I were just doing one book, there might have been a point where I was like, man, maybe I'm doing too much world building, because how much of this am I really going to use in a single book? But since my hope is to write numerous stories in this setting, the sky was the limit when it came to world building. I even thought about different time periods, not only this time period in the prequel, 100 years before the main story, but I've also thought about things coming up in the future that I could write stories about. For instance, one of the big things is when humanity starts building the first interstellar starship. That's something I'd love to do sometime, but that'd be a ways in the future from where we're at right now. So this approach, starting with this prequel and doing all the world building, has allowed me to build in some history and depth to the setting that I think will be really nice to have and really help lend some believability to it and hopefully make it a setting that readers can become immersed in. Also, as you know, if you're caught up on all the episodes of this podcast, a lot of my time that I spent doing research and world building was focused on developing a timeline of how we got from where we are now to where the setting is, and how these huge orbital cylinders got established and how that all came to be. Also, a big concern of mine was how long all this would take, because I wanted to have, a plausible answer for what year does this story take place in. So, once I'd done all that work into this timeline, picking a point in that timeline earlier than where I was going to put the main story and then developing that more wasn't actually that big of a deal to do, because I already had a lot of material for that I'd already come up with just to build the context for the main story. So in the end, I think that developing Luna City was easier than developing Union City as I thought it would be. I think for whatever reason, I'm not sure if it was because it's smaller or because it's the first one or just that's what I had ideas for. I'm not sure. But I do feel like it was easier to start there and then go up to the bigger city. And now that I've spent some time on Luna City and learning that place, I do feel like Union City, the larger cylinder, is easier to flesh out. I already have a good foundation built up to start with, if that makes sense. So I'm not sitting here recommending this strategy to you or anyone else. I don't know if it would really work on another project or not. There are a lot of things lining up that made this the way to go for me. Building this involved timeline and having this year by year, decade by decade account of what's happened in the history of the setting, doing so much research into the cylinders and what that would be like and the different sizes and how they would differ, having a main character who is a descendant of a character from a previous time period who still has a big impact on that main character and the person that they are and the person that they're becoming. So all these things kind of combined to make this the right way to go for me for this project. I don't know that it would work for someone else or that it would work for me for a different project, but for this particular thing, it was just what the doctor ordered, seems like. And yeah, now, where I'm at now, looking back and looking at where I'm at now, I think it was the perfect approach to take. And I don't think I could have found a better way to get where I am now. So this brings me back to, the question kind of this episode, which is, this all worked out really great, but was this intentional planning on my part? Was this by design, or was it serendipity? Was it a happy accident? And I don't know. I mean, I think it is a blend of the two, but it's kind of interesting when I started writing this episode, when I first started thinking about what I would say and what I would talk about in this episode, I think I was thinking more that it was serendipity, that I just got lucky or things just happened to work out that way. But thinking about it more and talking with you about it more, now I think, honestly, I think it was mostly by design. I think not necessarily that I knew how everything was going to go on the very first day, but every step of the way, everything I was doing was very calculated and was building on what I'd done before and was following just kind of where things took me. So it was, to go back to our discussion from an episode or so ago about, planning versus discovery writing, it was in a way like almost a perfect blend of the two. I mean, I did have some plans, but I was also discovering a lot, but then folding the things I discovered into the plans and revising the plans to better fit what I discovered, and then using that to project forward what came next. So I feel like it's both. I feel like it was almost a 50-50 blend of planning and just discovery writing, just winging it. So I have no idea how common that is, if that's how it is for everybody, and whether maybe these labels of I'm a discovery writer or I'm an outliner are really, really kind of artificial and maybe not even really accurate. And really most or all writers are a combination of the two, and you just use the two different techniques in different ways at different times. I don't know. But it's interesting to me because for me personally, before I started this book, I would have said I was definitely an outliner, definitely a planner, because that's how I wrote the last book. And then when I reread On Writing a couple times by Stephen King recently and heard him talk about how he discovery writes and heard the huge similarities between that and how I run role-playing games as a game master, that made me think, well, maybe I could be a discovery writer, or, maybe I have those skills and I don't even realize it, or I've never tried it. And so, with this book, I was very consciously, through the brute force writing specifically, trying to, have a go at discovery writing and seeing if I could do it and seeing how it would go for me and how, if I would like it or if it would come out well. And now on the other side of that, realizing that I'm really doing almost a perfect 50-50 blend of the two. And it's not, like Brandon Sanderson says, he discovery writes his characters, but then he plans the plot. For me, it's not like that at all. It's not like I can say, oh, I discovery write these aspects of the story and I plan these other aspects. It's more similar to being a game master, running a role-playing game. So for those of you that aren't gamers, that don't play or run tabletop role-playing games, kind of in a nutshell, what that's like is you kind of have a basic idea of where things are going, of a, kind of a skeleton of a plot or a situation and some ideas of where that situation could go. But then you present the situation to the players who play characters in the story, And then they take it in strange and unforeseen directions, depending on what they choose to do and how they choose to interact with the situation you created. And more often than not, as a GM, I have not been able to predict what the players will do or where they will go. So running a role-playing game is this kind of blend of, in some ways I'm planning what's going to happen. In some ways I kind of know what's going to happen and what's coming. But in other ways, I don't. And it's a surprise and things can take turns in new directions that I don't expect. And that's kind of how this has been. It's not a simple thing of just saying, I discovery write my characters and plan the plot, or, I discovery write the plot and plan the characters, or it's every step of the way. It seems like it's a combination of the two. And man, I had to split this up in 2 recordings, so I'm not sure how long this is going. I hope it's not going too long, but I feel like in a way, maybe I've been giving a bit of a false impression when I've been talking about how I'm doing what I'm doing, especially when I talk about the brute force writing, because when I go back and listen to the episodes, it kind of sounds like I'm saying I'm just completely winging it. When I sit down to write in the morning, I have no ideas whatsoever, and I'm just completely winging it. And that is true sometimes. But I think what I haven't been explicit about is that's not completely true. And so on a given writing day, when I am done, for the rest of the time until I start writing the next day, every spare moment I have, I'm thinking about where I left things and what could happen next. And ideally, by the time I sit down the next day, I at least have some ideas of where I want to go next. Now, those ideas are usually spent within a few hundred words. And so the rest of the 2,000 words is me winging it from there. But it's not accurate to say that I'm completely discovery writing. And it makes me wonder if even someone like Stephen King, does he really sit down fresh each day and have no idea where he's going? Or is he like me, in between writing sessions, thinking about what might happen next and coming up with some ideas? And then maybe he uses those ideas, maybe he doesn't the next day, but he's not coming in completely blind. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to talk to him more in depth to know. But at least for me, that's how it is. So it's not really a thing of, am I discovery writing or am I planning? I'm doing both. Ideally, when I sit down to write for a day, I have some idea where I'm going. I have some idea of what's going to happen next, but it's almost never enough to get me through 2,000 words. Like I said, it's usually enough to get me through a few hundred words, like maybe 300, 400, 500, 600 words, something like that. But I'm not even halfway there for the day. So I do, at that point, have to kind of come up with things. And it's also not like I'm writing nonstop. I write and then I sit and stare at the screen and think about what comes next. So to write, it varies day to day, but to write 2,000 words on a given day, it might take me 2 or 3 hours to do that from start to finish, but maybe only, 45 minutes of that or an hour of that is actually me banging on the keyboard. And the rest of the time is me sitting there pondering what I'm going to say next or what's going to happen next. So yeah, that's kind of how it's been going. So yeah, I guess my final thought for this is again, I'm not saying this would work for anyone else. I don't know if it would or not. But really, as a fellow writer listening to a writer talk about what they do, I mean, you probably don't want to be looking for things that you can just use whole cloth, because in my experience, it's very rare that I hear a writer talk about something and I'm going to go do that thing exactly the way they talked about it, and that's going to be what works for me. Usually, I use that idea as a starting point, and then I modify it to fit me and what I'm doing. So personally, as far as what value is there in all this stuff I've been talking about today for you, I don't think it's going to so much be, oh, you can just do exactly what I did and it's going to work for you. But my hope is that hearing me talk about what I did and why and what I was thinking and kind of how this all came to be and how it was very much this kind of organic process where I'm just kind of making it up as I go, and I'm constantly reacting to what I'm doing and what's happening, and it's not completely planned, but it's not completely unplanned either. It's not completely winging it, but there are aspects of winging it. It's complex, but I don't know. I just hope that maybe through that you'll gain some insight into not how to do things the way I do it, or not how to try to make the way I do it work for you, but rather how to figure out what will work for you, and how to take some ideas that you've had yourself or that you've heard from someone else that you thought, that sounds like that could work, or something similar to that could work for me, starting with that and then following your own process and your own story, and ending up with your process, whatever that is, that may have a lot of resemblance to the ideas you started with that you got from wherever, or maybe completely different, or maybe some blend. So yeah, that's my hope. And if I can do that for someone, then that's awesome. And for me as a writer, that's how it's been. I will take any opportunity I get to hear a writer that I enjoy their work talk about how they do what they do, because even if it's completely alien to me and not how I do things, I can usually glean some idea of something to try I haven't tried before, or some different spin on something I could try, or something. For instance, the On Writing book by Stephen King, this whole idea of his particular approach to discovery writing and how he does it, and having that word target. I've learned a lot about myself as a writer just by trying that and adapting that to make it work for me. And, my wife has brought up that I've probably changed a lot as a person since I wrote the last book. So that could be what's behind a lot of the differences in how I'm approaching it. But just kind of as my feeling, I'm much happier with my process now, and much more feel like I'm finding what really works for me now than how I felt when I was writing the last book. And the last book I thought came out really well. I mean, honestly, I think I could probably sell it if I really wanted to, but I don't for a few different reasons. But yeah, I'm happy with where I'm at as a writer, and I'm happy with the path I'm on, because I'm definitely not at the top of the mountain yet. I'm still climbing that mountain, and will be my entire life. The journey's never over as far as, becoming the best writer you can be. But, I look at the path in front of me, and I turn around and I look at the path behind me, and I see that I've made a lot of progress, and I'm really happy with where I'm at and with the pace at which I'm moving up that mountain. So, yeah, I hope that you can get to that same place yourself of finding what works for you, or at least beginning to find what works for you, and pursuing that. Because I think it's very rewarding, and it makes your writing better too. I assume. I hope. All right. So I would love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts on any of this, or any thoughts at all on anything, I would love to hear from you. The best way is to join our Discord. We have a Discord server, and you can get in there and talk with myself and other listeners, other writers. And yeah, join us there. You can find a link to that in the show notes for this episode at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. Also, I have an email. If you'd like to email me, that's lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find that linked in the show notes. I have a Twitter, which is also linked in the show notes, but that's at LexStarWalker. And I have a voicemail you can call, where you can call and leave a message. And I can even use that on the show if it's relevant and interesting. So that phone number is 951-465-5391. Again, all this information is in the show notes, which you can find at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And please let me hear from you. Let me know what you think of the show, any ideas for things you'd like to hear me talk about, or questions you have about what I'm doing or anything. And also, I'd love to hear what you're working on. If you're working on something, or if you're thinking about working on something, I'd love to hear about it. And it'd be great if you tell us about it in the Discord, so everyone can benefit from that. But if you'd rather just tell me, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you. All right, so that'll wrap it up for this week. I'll be back soon with another episode. And until then, keep writing.